Welcome. It's the Daily Objective. Jonathan Hoenig from capitalistpig.com. Delighted you're with us from not just the UK, better known as jolly old England in many circles, but in fact from all around the world. We are students of objectivism, fans of Ayn Rand, people who are interested in her writings and her teachings, learning about it together with some of really the brightest minds, as they say. Well, look, there's no stars in objectivism in my mind, besides Dr. Peikoff and Miss Rand, but certainly one of the brightest minds in objectivism, in my opinion. Joining us today, psychologist Gina Gorlin. You've seen her at OCONs, you've seen her speak, you've listened to her lecture. She is a psychologist, but she's also now especially focusing on advising high achievers and using all of her knowledge and insight for that. But we have corralled her today, and so delighted you're with us once again.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, most people, when you say you're interested in Ayn Rand, if they know anything, I might say something like, oh, well, that's just selfishness or capitalism or, something else. But what we wanted to talk about today is something uniquely different. In fact, a lot of what we're going to talk about today comes from, I think, one of Miss Rand's best books, but one of her least read and least understood. And that is, the book is The Romantic Manifesto. And we're talking about a sense of life. And what is that? What is a sense of life? Well, for one thing, it's a wonderful documentary, which, Gina, I know you mentioned you saw. This is going back to 1996. This is a documentary, got an Emmy Award nomination, very high profile. Now, look, it was the late 90s, so I think it's unfortunately a different culture now, but it's a wonderful documentary that talks about Miss Rand's life, her history, and her sense of life. But what we're going to be talking about today comes from primarily this book, The Romantic Manifesto. I don't know, Gina, I'm sure you can recognize a couple of those covers. You've probably had a few over the years and still do. But, for most people, even people who are interested in Ayn Rand don't know much about this. So with your permission, I thought we'd kind of delve right in and just kind of start defining our terms about just what the heck is it, why it's important. A quote from Miss Rand, if I could, and I'll happily turn the table over to you. Miss Rand says, "A sense of life is a preconceptual equivalent of metaphysics, an emotional, subconsciously integrated appraisal of man and existence. It sets the nature of a man's emotional responses and the essence of his character." Now, for a lot of people, their eyes glaze over when they hear that. Why is this important? What is it and why is it important?
Sure. Yeah. So I think one way to get at it is metaphorically, because on one hand, it is so abstract, and on the other hand, it's so endemic to all of our waking experience. I often analogize it to, it's like the weather, or really it's like the climate. It's like our internal climate. And you can see this in different people, sometimes more easily than in yourself, right? Like you can see like the person who sort of always has a chip on their shoulder. And then there's the person who like is chipper and can do, and, is always sort of assuming the best, and maybe sometimes even to a fault, right? That like they're going to be the ones who, of course, jump on the one slim hope that something might turn out well, and they're going to look for every possible reason for optimism, and and you end up kind of playing the naysayer role with them because they're so pulling you in that direction of like, no, let's hope that, right? And you've got people who tend to be really externalizing of responsibility, and the people who like they're going to jump to assume that there's something they could have done, right? And these are not necessarily like volitional processes that are happening at every moment in these people's waking lives, right? This is sort of like their default. It's like the autopilot. Like if they sort of let go the reins, like this is going to tend to be the way that their mind just works, right? These are the things that will tend to occur to them. These are the things that they'll tend to notice, right? These are the moods that they'll tend to project into the world without meaning to, just like when they're focused on something else, right?
And,
so
we know people are tabula rasa, so somewhere this was learned along the way.
Yes, that's very much, and it interacts with a lot of things about our temperaments and of course, our experiences. But yeah, definitely, and we know this through a lot of really interesting research in psychology. And I think Rand, really derives it sort of from observations from first principles that we have to form these beliefs, and we form them early on, and we sort of have no choice about coming to certain conclusions implicitly without necessarily ever putting them into words, without having any clue necessarily what they are. But there are certain questions to which functionally we sort of have to operate as if we have a certain answer, like the question of, what's my purpose in this world, right? Like, for whom do I take action? Like, for whose sake, right? Like, who is the beneficiary of my actions? And can I operate in this world? Is this world knowable, predictable, right? Controllable by me? Can I control my fate, my outcomes? Does what I do matter, right? And, is this overall, is this a world where I can expect to be able to be happy and achieve values, or is it not?
Does it come down to, is this like basically saying, well, he's a glass half full person and she's a glass half empty person? Is that basically, I'm playing a little bit as devil's advocate here, but isn't that what kind of sense of life is? You glass half full or glass half empty? And does that mean anything at all?
I mean, I think in a way, like that's a conventional and very watered down heuristic for what is in fact an aspect of our sense of life, insofar as whether we, by and large, all else being equal, tend to expect that things will work out, tend to frame things in terms of their action affordances, right? Tend to be kind of oriented toward goals, oriented toward values, oriented toward possibilities, versus we tend to be more risk averse. We tend to be more cautious, more afraid, more driven by our fear, right? Like that is a really important sense of life difference. And there are beliefs underlying it, right? It's not just this irreducible, like, do you choose glass half empty or glass half full as your mindset, right?
Well, and the fact, and you alluded to this a bit, and I definitely want you to get into it a little bit more. And kind of what fascinates me about sense of life is that, at least from my kind of understanding of Miss Rand's reading, is that a lot of this, and you alluded to, is kind of formed when we're young, before we even know anything about heuristics and metaphysics. I mean, it's right. And I'll share my screen again quickly and quote a little bit more for her. She says, long before he is old enough to grasp such a concept as metaphysics, man makes choices, forms value judgments, experiences emotions, and acquires a certain implicit view of life. Every choice and value judgment implies some estimate of himself, of the world around him, most particularly of his capacity to deal with the world. I'll throw it over to you. Take it away. What is that? What is that telling us?
Yeah. So again, I think she's identifying certain sort of fundamental assumptions or fundamental questions to which we implicitly rely on certain answers. We sort of add up our experiences and add up our own thinking or lack thereof, right? And our own processing or lack thereof of those experiences in a way that inevitably adds up to certain general estimations, right? Like we generalize, right? From the particular things that have happened to us and sort of how we react to them and how we interpret them, to a general sense that we bring to every other experience that we have, to every choice that we make, right? Like, should I bother trying to figure this out? Right? Is this likely to actually serve me if I put work into trying to figure this out? No, is this solvable? Am I the kind of person?
That's what makes it seem so. The more I kind of went back and thought about, that's what I said this to you a little bit before we started. That's what makes it seem almost so shockingly important to any discussion of your life, of your sense of self. Ms. Rand says he may draw conscious conclusions, which may be true or false. He may remain mentally passive and merely react to events, merely feel. Whatever the case may be, his subconscious mechanism sums up his psychological activities, integrating his conclusions, reactions, or invasions into an emotional sum that establishes a habitual pattern and becomes his automatic response to the world around him. We never talk about things that are automatic and objective, isn't it? We're thinking, we're conscious. So this just seems so important that as kids, we are thrown a lot of stimulus that form a real important onion that guides our life.
Very much
or
so.
Can, or can guide our life.
Very much so. And I think it's worth just noting that part of the richness of her concept of a sense of life is that it's not just reducible to, like, you can take a little quiz and do you answer yes or no to these 5 metaphysical questions, right? It's a style. It's an overall style of being that's in some ways like your signature, right? That's not replicable. It's very distinctive to every human being. And it has so much nuance to it. It's not just like, well, do you think the world is dealable with? It's like, what particular emphasis do you place emotionally? Like, are you the person who, like, Rand spoke about how for her, like, if she had a theme song, it would be individualism, right? Like, that's not my theme song. Like, my theme song has to do with like growth and self-change and the capacity for us to shape ourselves anew, right? Like as a psychologist, and also with connection and with the kind of the deep intimacy that's possible when we engage in win-win relationships, with people who challenge us, right? Like there are certain things, and then those themes carry themselves through a whole bunch of the ways that what I cry at when I watch, movie or commercial or, random things that my toddler says that suddenly like, why am I tearing up? What is this for? Like all the little associations. It's the style of a soul, the style of a personality that has these core components to it, but also it has a lot of uniqueness and a lot of richness to it as well.
Yeah, I mean, the more, and obviously we want to encourage everyone to read Miss Rand's work about this in Romantic Manifesto. It's not, obviously, as you said, just, well, he's a happy or sad person. It's so multifaceted. There's so many ways to, and I want to get to this part as well, but kind of oftentimes it seems difficult to even isolating it. And, most people you'd say, well, what's your sense of life? They might say, hey, I'm a happy guy. I'm a pretty happy guy, but maybe they're not being so conscious and introspective about exactly what's going on here. This is Miss Rand's, I think, kind of talking about summing it up. She says what began as a series of single discrete conclusions or evasions about his own particular problems becomes a generalized feeling about existence, an implicit metaphysics with the compelling motivational power of a constant basic emotion. Emotion, this is the part which kills me, if you will, emotion which is part of all his other emotions and underlies all his experiences. This is a sense of life. So it's like if you grew up with a bad sense of life, you've got some work to do, it just seems, because it's on you and you didn't consciously pick it. You didn't choose it.
It's a lot of the work that I help people do that I've helped myself to do. And, it's still a work in progress.
I remember Dr. Peikoff in one of his podcasts was asked about changing one's sense of life. And I'm sure you probably discussed this with him, but I remember him saying, at least as I recall, you can do it, but it takes work. It is not easy to do. What's that like with you?
Agreed.
when you come to people and they bring you, do you throw this to them at all in terms of sense of life? Is it something that you work with them explicitly? Do you talk with them about it, or is it just behind the scenes, if you will?
Sure. I probably never used the term sense of life as such in a therapy or coaching session, not necessarily because I think it's a bad term, but just because I really proceed from the person's context and from their way of relating to these experiences. And we sort of develop our own distinctive terminology between the two of us, usually, with whoever I'm coaching. But I do talk fairly explicitly with them about, for example, their mindset, which often is referring to something very close, very similar, but with an emphasis on, like, let's actually figure out what are the movable parts of this mindset, right? Like, you have a mindset that sort of tends to assume the worst about people, right? Or you have a mindset that, like, these are some of the core beliefs underlying this mindset. The core belief that you are fragile, or the core belief that people, by and large, are going to abandon you, and that it's impossible for you to predict or to judge, that you're a terrible judge of character. Okay, now what can we do to actually move first of all, do you believe that? Right. First, just check in with their conscious assessment, right? And sometimes they won't be so sure. Like, well, some part of me does believe that, because look at the ways that, people have treated me, or look at the ways that situations have, like, I didn't really handle this at all. When I was 5 and my dad walked out on me, or when I was, being abused, or when this horrible thing happened, like, I completely broke down, and that sort of set the model for me of how I handle difficult situations. I don't know if I could handle something like that again. I don't even know if I could handle thinking about it again, right? So if they're not consciously convinced one way or another whether that premise is true, then the first task is for us to align on, okay, well, let's really think through the evidence, think through the logic of, like, how likely is it to be true? Like, what is the evidence for and against, right? And what are some of the missing kind of middle terms in the logical string here that you've been proceeding from, where consciously you think this at least might be true? And then at the point where they at least are willing to question it, that's when we go into the world, and when we subject it to behavioral experiments or corrective experiences. Psychology has lots of names for this, but that's where, like, you actually have to do the reprogramming. You have to actually go out and give yourself and give your whole, mind, body, organism compelling experiential proof to the contrary, right? And you have to amass a wealth of that kind of experience.
Yeah, I mean, Rand talks about kind of my own interpretation of the payoff being when it's all integrated, when it's all kind of working together. But it's so, it's almost like, well, it's just so unavoidable. And so here's Miss Rand again. She says it's difficult to identify. A given person's sense of life is hard to identify conceptually because it is hard to isolate. It is involved in everything about the person, in his every thought, his emotion, action, in his every response, in his every choice and value, in his every spontaneous gesture, in his manner of moving, talking, smiling, in the total of personality. It's that which makes him a personality. Pretty rare to see that type of comprehensive analysis here. And when you just think about, well, objectivism, reason, purpose, self-esteem, that self-esteem, I mean, this is so much of what we're talking about here. You can't escape it.
Yep. I mean, in sense of life, it straddles, in effect, so it's the emotional summing up, right? It's just sort of your implicit view of the totality of the big important questions of basically like, am I capable and worth it, right? And so how am I and how is the world, in effect? So your self-esteem is like half of your sense of life. if we were to draw some sort of, diagram, right? It's your self-esteem and it's like your world esteem, right? It's like your assessment of, okay, what can I expect from the world and what can I expect from myself?
But most people don't even, I mean, I remember at some point, Ms. Rand says, the problem isn't emotions, but you say, what am I feeling and why am I feeling it? But it just seems like most people don't do any introspection at all. They're just, I mean, again, I'm kind of quoting from her work. She says, introspectively, one sense of life is experienced as an absolute and an irreducible primary, as that which one never questions because the thought of questioning it never arises. So people never even think like, oh, maybe I just have a bad sense of life, or I guess they do. Some do.
Well, I have a skewed sample, right? Because most of the people I come into contact with, whether because they're coming to me for, professional help or support, or because they're colleagues who also think about this stuff, they tend to be the people who at least are asking those questions and are interested in like, what are my implicit value judgments and my, whether they use that terminology because they're objectivist or whether they speak in terms of like core schemas, if they're kind of CBT types with cognitive behavioral therapy, adherence, or they talk about like representations and internalized objects if they come from a psychoanalytics, but they talk about it.
Well, I mean, I love just in terms of Rand's history too, it's so, people say, oh, this is just determinism, right? Hey, if you were born in a terrible household, you're a terrible, but I remember reading that Miss Rand, who had a wonderful, in my estimation, had a real joyous, benevolent, ambitious sense of life, and even despite how she grew up, in her environment growing up. And as I understand it, then her sister came to visit years later from the Soviet Union, and she didn't have that sense of life at all. So we are self-made people, despite whatever we're given. We still can remake ourselves in our own fashion, despite that early sense of life.
Well, that is a pretty core belief of mine, considering the work that I do. But more to the point, I've done it and I've observed it. And so, I feel like this is one of the places where I really know of what I speak when I say that, yeah, no, we can reshape ourselves.
What about, I'll quote again quickly, the other side of Miss Rand has a quote where, is it so easy to judge in other people? Like, can you just look at somebody who's a sourpuss and say, well, they have a bad sense of life? She says yes, because she says retrospectively, the sense of another person strikes one as an immediate yet undefinable impression on very short acquaintance, an impression which is often feels like certainty, yet is exasperatingly elusive. So is it safe just to say, he looks like a sourpuss, he's probably a sourpuss? I mean, there's that kind of judging a book by its cover, if you will? I'm being a little
no.
saucy,
It's a great question. It's complicated. So, I think there's something she's getting at that's very real, in that there are certain immediate impressions that we get from people, and that some of those impressions will stand the test of time. even in ways that we might not expect or understand or be able to articulate. I also think that a lot of our impressions turn out wrong. I mean, we know this. We know that first impressions often lie, and we know that, you know, people in fact can vary widely from day to day depending on their mood and depending on the circumstances in terms of how they present and come across. And someone can seem very confident and self-assured in a dating or social context and then be a complete mess at work, right? Or when it comes to actually like dealing with the first conflict that arises and then they run for the hills, right? So it's extremely difficult, especially because most people aren't completely integrated. Most people aren't so consistent that you get this immediate sense, and then that's just what's going to be predictive of, you know, how they present over time, right? And I think we're also just like it's a real achievement. It's a hard-won skill to be able to read people the way that I think she's implying. So, you know, I wouldn't be too fast and loose and classifying people's sense of life.
Sure. Well, and of course, at least, you know, I think I remember her also being asked, you know, that she would know Frank's sense of life, but it's very hard to know someone else's real sense of life. I mean, it's, you know, as you're a trained professional, it's very, but you know, I mean, my interest is not going around judging everyone else's sense of life, but, you know, thinking about it for myself, working on it. It's that type of thing that's always been with you, but you've never really probably stopped and thought seriously about it over time. Maybe you just say, oh, that's just who I am, whatnot. You know, Miss Rand says, again, this is quoting from her, this leads many people to regard a sense of life as the province of some sort of special intuition, as a matter perceivable only by some special non-rational insight. And that's, I guess, how I've thought. It's just, oh, I just have this sense. But here's where I think she's talking about what you do, Gina. The exact opposite is true. A sense of life is not an irreducible primary. It's a complex sum. It can be felt, but it cannot be understood by automatic reaction. It has to be analyzed, identified, and verified conceptually. So doing some work on that. Now, if someone can't necessarily see a therapist or they don't have the money or whatnot, where do they start in terms of getting a sense of their own sense of life? Like, where do you start?
I mean, there's lots of tools that are available now, many of them for free on the internet, that including books and like worksheets and handouts that can just at least start to build an emotional vocabulary for a person. Like that's probably in terms of the real starting, like the rudiments. If you've never thought about this at all before and you're just starting to explore, like what even are the first questions to ask, you know, I would start by just like developing a vocabulary of emotions and identifying, looking for the signs in yourself, kind of just learning about like, okay, so, you know, anger tends to correspond to these physical signs, you know, like I'm gritting my teeth, I feel tense, I feel tight, my voice gets raised, you know, I might be like breathing faster. And conceptually, it tends to correspond to these implicit judgments that somebody is being unjust toward me, that there's been some sort of violation of my rights or my person or somebody I care about, right? And that there's like something actionable to be done, right? That there's like the possibility of some sort of remediation or remuneration, or right, like somebody owes me something. So that's the kind of premise I'm looking for. And so if I feel angry, I might check with myself, like, do I think that there's been an injustice? If so, what do I believe that injustice was? Is that actually all I feel, or is there also a sadness underneath? Because I also feel like there's a sense of loss that, you know, I can't get this thing back. And okay, that feels a little bit different. And what does it feel like when I have that like kind of saddish anger versus the more anxious anger versus like the kind of action oriented anger that actually makes me want to charge in and, you know, fend for my values. There's lots of different ways to kind of start to learn about, okay, you know, the kinds of premises that tend to correspond with different emotions, the kinds of the feel of different emotions, and then just noticing and as much as possible, like cataloging. You know, I do recommend at least at some point in someone's early self-reflection or introspective, you know, self-education, that you write stuff down, that you keep a journal, use a like thought record, you know, CBT, again, the cognitive behavioral therapies or toolkit is full of these. If you literally just Google like thought record, CBT thought record, mood journal, you'll find a billion of these to choose from. There's just free handouts on the internet where you can track, you know, okay, so here's the situation, just the facts. Like, here's what happened. Here's what I was feeling. Like, just name the feelings. Okay, now here's what the thought I was having or the thoughts. Like, what must I have been assuming? What must the value judgment have been? Like, you know, this person didn't say hi to me in the hall and I felt angry and maybe also a little bit like betrayed and maybe judged. Okay, well, what would I have had to have been assuming? Okay, I assumed that they were snubbing me. I assumed that they had bad intentions. Okay, now what are the facts? What do I actually know about the situation? Does that come up a lot? And do I notice like it even comes up when there's not actually that much evidence for it? Maybe that's some piece of my sense of life that I ought to look at.
Even this process that you're taking us through, even hypothetically, it's such an opposition to kind of what seems to be the way it is today, with people kind of have an emotion and they go with it. And then you say, oh, I'm for reason. And they say, oh, you're just like Dr. Spock. You have no emotions at all. But I forgot, Dr. Peikoff, maybe Dr. Brooks said in effect that emotions are important. You just have to know their place. My words now, they're not necessarily driving the ship, but this, does it impress you? It's got to impress you that Miss Rand unpacked all of this without any of the psychological training that you've had.
I mean,
no,
that would be an understatement. Yes, I'm very impressed with what she achieved. She's a genius in my assessment. It's really, I mean, she had profound insight on things that I think we're still unpacking and trying to understand to this day.
And why do you think it's important that this whole conversation about sense of life is in her book about, or her essays about art? People would say, well, what is that doing? Because I think people miss it oftentimes, because say, oh, I'm not interested in art, I'm not going to read this, but I just can't get by escaping sense of life. We all have to deal with this tonight.
Yes, do it. Yes.
I mean, it's so integral to every day. And Miss Rand talks about that. Why is it in her work on art?
It's a great question. Yeah. So Rand also has a very insightful and distinctive view, right? An understanding of art and its role in human life and in consciousness, right? And like, what is the value of art? And I buy her view. I think it's borne out for me with experience, which is that art has this unique kind of distilling property, right? Where it sums up for us in really vivid form, whether if you think of a painting where every aspect of the painting has been selected by the artist in order to convey whatever, some theme, some impression, right? Where the artist's own sense of life presumably is driving the selection process, right? So it's their selective recreation of reality according to their value judgments, right? According to whatever their standards of, like, what do they think is important? What do they think is worth representing, right? Worth kind of putting up as a representation of, like, this is the reality, that like this is what matters and this is how I think things are in principle, enough of the time for enough people, right, to be worth presenting in this way. And so the reactions that we have to art, or whether, especially, I think it's especially clear with narrative art, where there's a story arc, where there's a character, and that character is kind of represents certain values and certain ways of living and fares ill or bad, fares well or fares ill. If we think about Rand's own novels, and for me, certainly some of the earliest, strongest sense of life reactions that I can remember having were to the novels and to the characters in the books, because they have been very carefully dramatized, right? They have been stylized in a way that really makes concrete, instead of this really like abstract set of definitions you just read us, which is like, okay, sure, yes, metaphysical value judgments of this. Like, you see the image of a man standing at the edge of a cliff naked, laughing without a worry in the world the day that he's just been expelled from his university. What? Right? Like, what, like you just experience the whole sum of, like, and at the time, without knowing how the story was going to end, I wrote about this back in the day in one of my Fountainhead essays in high school. Like, I thought, okay, well, obviously he's about to jump to his death. That's the only way that this scene could make any sense, based on everything I'd read and experienced up to that point. Like, the guy's about to kill himself. That's why he's laughing and he seems so carefree, and he's, no, like, that's the only way. And then he didn't. And then he, blissfully took a blissful swim, and then took this kind of stroll back to his dean's office, noticing all the potentiality of all the hills and all the, the raw materials around him, only to then go be expelled and like feel really lighthearted about it, right? So art just has a way of like focusing those deep, fundamental, metaphysical value judgments into really vivid, concrete kind of instantiations that then we can gain a lot of insight from how we react to them, right?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense on some level. They give young people art therapy and show what type of artwork they make. I mean, I'm talking out of my tuchus here. I don't know what I'm talking about, but kind of what do they choose to put on that piece of paper?
Yeah,
what
can be very diagnostic absolutely, for sure. Both, diagnostic and therapeutic. Yeah.
And Miss Rand has the line in the Romantic Manifesto, and I'm kind of summarizing here, where she says, well, if you saw a beautiful woman who happened to have a birthmark or whatever, you would never even think about it. But if you were painting that picture and said, oh, we got to draw a big birthmark here, you'd say, what's that sense of life? What's going on there?
Exactly.
Thank you to all of our great super chatters, and most importantly, our super chatters. Mary-Aline is a big fan of yours, Dr. Gorlin. She wants to know, what do you think of Carol Dweck's book, Mindset?
Sure, happy to speak to. So I love Carol Dweck's work. I think it's net positive in terms of what it's identifying and what it gets right, and how needed those insights are, I think, culturally and within education. So just as context for those who aren't familiar, so Carol Dweck is a psychologist who's done a lot of sort of experimental research and written on this concept of a growth mindset as distinguished from a fixed mindset, where a growth mindset refers to basically the belief, and she actually calls it an implicit belief, that you can change and grow, and basically, like, you can control the kinds of abilities you develop through work, through effort, right? And so it's really important to then she has various recommendations about how to praise children and how not to praise them, various things. And then we could take issue with some of it's good, some of it. But, as in contrast to her, the kind of fixed mindset, which in effect implies that you have an innate level of intelligence or ability, and it is what it is, and you don't really have any control over it, which then leads to being sort of aversive to effort, right? Or finding effort aversive and feeling like, it either should be easy, it should come naturally and automatically, or something's wrong with me.
Well, I have to say, I wanted to focus on sense of life today, but I'm going to corral you hopefully back, because I want to do a whole nother.
This isn't irrelevant. If you want, I can try to connect the dots really quickly.
Oh no, I was just going to quickly say, I wanted to also corral you back to talk about benevolent universe premise and malevolent universe premise. I didn't want to get into that today, but it sounds like even there's some overlap there. That's a whole other area that Ms. Rand wrote about and Dr. Peikoff wrote about. That sounds like there's some overlap as well.
Totally, yeah. Even all these things are connected, as they would be, right? Given that sense of life sort of sums up all these kind of universal value judgments that are going to show up in everything, right? And so they're going to all connect up to each other. So even just like taking growth mindset just as our starting point, just for fun, to kind of see how everything connects. So growth mindset is Dweck's particular way of referring to a belief about in effect, our agency, right? Like, do we have agency? Do we have free will? Do we have choice and control over who we become and over our capability, over how capable we become? Or is it fated, right? Is it set for us, predetermined? And then if you think about, benevolence and malevolence, where the benevolent universe premise in effect comes down to the conviction that we live in a world where that's friendly to our values. We live in a world where by and large, we can make things happen that we want to have happen. We can achieve our goals. We can achieve our happiness. It's like the conditions are favorable, right? Doesn't mean that the world is like going to swoop in and do it for us, right? But just
or that we get everything we want,
that anything's guaranteed, right? It's rather the conviction that we can do what we set our minds to, in effect, right? Which is a very oversimplified way of putting it, but that's kind of the the gist. Now, if you think about, so is someone with growth mindset versus someone with a fixed mindset, if that's all we know about them, which one is headed for a more malevolent versus a more benevolent universe premise, right? Like the one who is allergic to trying and to really engaging deeply with whatever they're trying to learn or master, right? And so inevitably kind of setting themselves up to fail, and who's also interpreting failure as a kind of metaphysical signal that like you are fundamentally unfit, right? You're not going to end up with a very benevolent universe premise coming out of that.
Just out of curiosity, does Carol Dweck also kind of concur that a lot of this is born from those early childhood emotional experiences. That's where it all starts. And actually, that's a bridge. I assume so because that's a bridge to my question. Did you ever see the Disney movie The Fox and the Hound?
I don't think so. Even though I've been seeing a lot of Disney movies lately. Yeah.
This is an old one. The fox and the hound become friends, and then they have to, their society has forced them to fight each other, right? The fox is supposed to run, the hound. So in one of them, I believe at the end dies. It completely ruined me. I think I almost want to see if I can go back against Disney for damages, given I think the amount of psychological terror.
Oh no!
It's my way of
maybe
saying,
I won't show it to my toddler. Then.
Oh no! This is I don't know what they show now to kids, but The Fox and the Hound. Let me know in the super chat if you agree with me. This is it's the type of thing because you've got to be so sensitive, and I want to take your whole afternoon, but you've got to be so sensitive as a parent about what you're showing your kid because you are creating that sense of life.
Well, I mean, so I'm very much
not you, but any parent.
I'm in the thick of this because I have a toddler who's, just about to turn 2, and we're very much, curating her experience for better and worse. And I mean, in a way, yeah, I feel very much, responsible based on, and it's really exciting too, to think, okay, well, like she is internalizing Sound of Music into her soul. Like she has most of the songs memorized now, and she goes around, she like asks me to sing her So Long Farewell, and she can sing most of it back. And she just, it delights me so much that like, this is just going to be part of the fabric of her soul from so early on. And at the same time, it's also a little bit humbling to watch her develop because like she's already developed some sort of a sense of life, and I've had only so much input at the end of the day. Like, and certainly like parents who've seen 2 children who they've tried very much to curate their experiences similarly, but like they end up being such different kids, and not necessarily one worse than the other, but just like have very different interests and very different, again, like emphases, right? The things that move them, the things that make them cry, the things that like the way that they present their, one of them's bubbly and one of them's sort of serious and introverted, right? And like those are senses of life, and both may have amazingly great healthy metaphysics but still be really different. Yeah. So there's really only so much.
Henrik compliments you. He says this is effects excellent. Thank you, Henrik. Marilyn, thank you for your contribution again. She asks, Dr. Gorlin, can relationships work if couples or friends have very different senses of life? She knows it's not a simple question, but that's a good one. I mean, do opposites attract in a sense, or do you need? I really want to know the answer to that. What is it?
Yeah, I mean, it really, really depends on what you mean by different. I mean, and again, in a way, every 2 people will have different senses of life, right? There are no 2 identical senses of life. It's like your signature, right? It's like your thumbprint. And there are certain complementary features, I think, that actually work really well insofar as, and there are lots of, part of what that means is you could have an overall rational, overall benevolent, overall can do, right, sense of life, and look extremely different from someone else for whom all of that is also true, right? Where you might have different sensitivities, like the different parts of your senses of life might be a little bit shaky or fragile, right? Like I have joked for many, many years about my MUP. That's the malevolent universe premise that I've sort of had to fight off pretty actively. And now I would say I'm quite benevolent on the whole, but I've definitely, had experiences growing up and into my young adulthood where I sort of very much assumed that, like I would speak of it as an impermanence, that people would disappoint me, let me down, and that first impressions were everything. And that if I screwed it up on the first impression, then that was it. It was too late to ever recover. And there were just certain things that, and I just also, I had messed up in certain ways just because of like skill deficits that I didn't know how to sort of repair yet, that made me really, really afraid to take on certain ventures. And I would be really I would still dive in, but I would be really anxious and I would be preoccupied and be ruminating on all the ways I could fail. And I don't do most of that anymore, but like I still have little twinges of sort of, oh, you're leaving me for a week to go on this trip. And, yes, like, of course, I know you're not abandoning me, and we all know, and we can joke about it, but like, I'm going to miss you and I want you back. Or, when my daughter is sitting on my lap, I don't want to like, I won't go to the bathroom. Like, there are just certain things I won't do because I'm afraid to like lose this precious, fragile moments connection with her, even though that's really dumb because, I know she's not going anywhere. And like, my husband just has absolutely none of that. This is just to give an example. Like, he just couldn't possibly, like, there's never in his mind was there any question like of abandonment, or like, he's never really he's never been insecure in some of the ways that I have, and he's never sort of doubted his own efficacy in some of the ways that I have. And for me, that's a really nice balance. And at the same time, like, I am sensitive to people's sensitivities in ways that sometimes he's not, in ways that, like, he could sometimes be pretty short with people. He can sometimes, like, err on the side of just saying, like, just deal with it. Just like step up. Like, what is your, where, like, I know that it's really hard and that, someone is really struggling. And so I have certain ways of addressing some of his blind spots because I've had, some of the particular sensitivities I have. And I manage anger arguably better. I don't know if if he ever listens to this, maybe he has a different view, but I think he'd probably agree with me. Like, he's not great with anger. That it trips up something in his sense of life, just like a really strong sense of injustice, that's a little bit exaggerated relative to like the real stakes, in a particular circumstance, where like I'm really good at putting those in perspective. So just an example where I think we complement each other really nicely. And I could imagine infinite other configurations of complementary senses of life. And then there's certain ones that probably don't work together as well, but that's because of the particular ways that they either trigger each other or that they don't give each other visibility. Because I think visibility is really key in a relationship. The deeper, the more intimate the relationship, the more important the visibility, right? And for some people, it's more important that, like, I couldn't have a relationship where certain parts of my sense of life weren't really visible.
Well, this is, no, it's so fascinating. It's so valuable to our audience, and so many appreciative messages. And for you exploring this topic with us, we want to come back and do it more. I mean, I used to talk about, someone with a smoking habit or a drug addiction is like the monkey on his or her back. And to me, sense of life, you could probably also make a similar type of analogy. I mean, it can be a monkey holding you down, or it can be as they say, pair of wings lifting you up with a positive sense of life. But, it requires, seems like it really requires the type of introspection, analysis. It doesn't cost you a lot even to do your own introspection, to do your own thinking. But it's that process that I know has been really powerful for people who've embraced what Ms. Rand talked about. So
a lot of payoff, for sure.
Good, great payoff. Well, thank you. You've just been so delightful and so insightful. So we'll have you back again once again. Thank you so much, Gina.
My pleasure. Yeah, thanks for all the great questions, everyone, and thank you for curating the discussion so well, John.
Gina Gorlin, just one of the great voices you see here on the Daily Objective on the Ayn Rand Center UK. We're trying to cultivate a world of objectivism and a world of students of objectivism, all learning together from, Dr. Gorlin was, she is a student of objectivism now, but she was literally, I think you were an OIC student as well, as I recall. So it's just such a pleasure to be able to learn from people with these various expertises. We can do it because of your support to the Ayn Rand Center UK, super chats, and subscription. We'll see you tomorrow with the Daily Collective, in quotes, and thank you and have a great evening.